The words, slick with condescension, slithered across the polished mahogany table. She is just staff. Chairman Kong, Julian's uncle, and the architect of his gilded cage, dismissed her with a flick of his wrist, a gesture as casual as shooing a fly. He turned back to his associates, men with eyes like chips of obsidian, their bespoke suits unable to conceal the menace that clung to them like expensive cologne. Ilara froze. Her hand, holding a silver tray laden with champagne flutes, trembled almost imperceptibly. Just staff. The two words struck her with the force of a physical blow, erasing her name, her face, her very existence. In this room, a penthouse that scraped the clouds, she was nothing more than a function, a pair of hands. Her worn but clean uniform suddenly felt like a costume for the invisible. She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood, her spine ramrod straight, fighting the hot sting of tears. Humiliation was a bitter, familiar taste. Across the table, Julian Kang went still. The world seemed to slow, the ambient murmur of conversation fading into a dull, distant roar. He watched the subtle tremor in Ilara's hand, saw the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw the way she drew a breath, a tiny, sharp intake of air, as if to brace herself. And something inside him, a cold, dormant thing, snapped. He had brought her here, into his world, promising to protect her. He had placed her at this table not as staff, but as his guest, his equal. And his own family had laid her low with two careless words. He pushed his chair back, the sound of wood scraping against marble a gunshot in the sudden silence he commanded. Every eye in the room swiveled to him. His face was a mask of placid fury, his dark eyes fixed not on his uncle, but on the men seated at the table. "Clear the table," Julian said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. The men, powerful figures in their own right, exchanged confused glances. Minjun, Julian's loyal second-in-command, standing by the wall, took a half-step forward, his expression questioning. Julian's gaze did not waver. It was flat, empty of all warmth. "I said, clear the table." He gestured with his chin towards the door. "All of you, get out." A nervous chuckle escaped one of the associates. "Julian, your uncle was just... now." The word was a blade of ice. The atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile. Chairs scraped. Men rose, their bravado evaporating under the sheer intensity of his command. They mumbled apologies, their eyes darting between Julian and his uncle, who now sat stunned into silence, his face a mottled canvas of disbelief and rage. They filed out of the room, a retreat of tailored suits and shattered confidence, leaving only Julian, his uncle, Minjun, and Ilara. Ilara hadn't moved. She was a statue carved from shock. Julian walked around the table, his movements fluid and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his presence a shield between her and the venomous glare of Chairman Kang. He gently took the heavy silver tray from her hands and set it down with a soft thud. Then, his fingers, surprisingly warm, cupped her elbow. He turned to face his uncle, his eyes burning with a cold fire that Ilara had never seen. "Her name," he said, his voice lethally soft, "is Ilara Vance, and the only reason anyone in this room has the privilege of breathing her air is because I allow it." He held his uncle's furious gaze for a beat longer, a silent declaration of war. Then, without another word, he guided Ilara from the oppressive silence of the dining room, his touch a firm, protective anchor in a world that had just tried to render her invisible. 6 months earlier, she had been just that, invisible. Ilara balanced the tray of half-empty glasses, the clinking a familiar soundtrack to her life. She moved through the glittering crowd at the St. Regis Grand Gala with practiced ease, a ghost in a black uniform. Her world was one of service, of anticipating needs and fading into the background. She was an expert at not being seen. She collected empty plates, offered canapés, and refilled champagne flutes, her face a polite, neutral mask. Her mind, however, was miles away, calculating whether this paycheck would cover rent and the overdue bill for her mother's medication. It was why she hadn't noticed him at first. How could she? Julian Kang did not exist in her orbit. He was the center of a different galaxy, one of immense gravity and dark, shimmering light. He stood by a marble column, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, observing the room with an air of profound boredom. Men in suits that cost more than her car approached him with deference. Women in glittering gowns offered smiles that he did not return. He was a king in a court he clearly despised. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and cold, a search for nothing. And then it stopped. It was as if the world snapped into focus. Julian felt it like a physical jolt, a sudden cessation of all noise and movement. He saw her across the ballroom, weaving through the throng. She wasn't wearing a designer gown or draped in jewels. She wore a simple black uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and a smudge of something, chocolate maybe, was on her cheek. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way the other women in the room were. There was a weariness in the set of her shoulders, but a fierce stubbornness in her chin. And her eyes. When she briefly looked up, scanning the room for her next task, her eyes were the color of moss after a storm, deep and alive with a resilience that felt more real than anything else in this room of polished illusions. Time froze. For Julian, it was a literal heart-stopping pause. The cacophony of the gala faded to a hum. The glittering chandeliers blurred into streaks of light. There was only her. A woman who was just staff. A woman who, in that single, stolen glance, had captured the entirety of his attention. He felt an immediate, inexplicable pull, a sense of recognition that defied logic. It was a punch to the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Who was she? Minjun appeared at his side, following his line of sight. "Sir, is something wrong?" Julian didn't tear his eyes away from her. "Find out who she is," he murmured, his voice rough. Minjun, ever efficient, ever discreet, saw the caterer. He raised a skeptical eyebrow, but knew better than to question the tone in Julian's voice. "Her name? I don't know. Just find out. Everything." Ilara felt a prickling on the back of her neck, the unnerving sensation of being watched. She scanned the room again, her gaze briefly snagging on a man by a pillar. He was tall, impossibly handsome in a severe, almost brutal way, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to him. And he was staring directly at her, not at her tray, not through her, but at her. His stare was intense, unwavering, and it made her skin crawl. It wasn't the lecherous look she sometimes got from drunken guests. It was something else entirely, analytical, possessive. She broke eye contact immediately, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She ducked into the kitchens, the heat and clatter a welcome shield. Creep. That's what he was. Just another rich, entitled man who thought everything and everyone was his for the taking. She shook it off. She had a job to do. She had bills to pay. She didn't have time for the predatory games of the 1%. For the rest of the night, she felt his eyes on her. It was a tangible pressure, a weight she carried with her from table to table. She refused to look his way again, focusing on her work with a defiant intensity. When her shift finally ended, she slipped out a service exit, pulling her thin coat tight against the city's damp chill and hurrying toward the subway, eager to put the gilded cage of the gala and the unnerving stare of the man in the perfect suit behind her. She had no idea that for Julian Kang, the night had just begun. He watched her leave from the window of his penthouse suite, a floor-to-ceiling glass wall that overlooked the city. He saw her small figure hurry down the street, a stark contrast to the gleaming limousines pulling away from the curb. Minjun entered the room, holding a tablet. "Her name is Ilara Vance, 26. Lives in a walk-up in Queens with a roommate. Works 2 jobs, this catering company and a barista at a coffee shop in the mornings. Her mother is in a nursing facility upstate. Looks like Miss Vance is footing the bill. No criminal record. No significant debts, but she's clearly living paycheck to paycheck. She's studying art history online when she can. The information was clinical, a sterile summary of a life of struggle. Julian imagined her hands, which he'd noticed were calloused when she reached for a glass, and felt a strange ache in his chest. "The coffee shop," Julian said, turning from the window. "What time does her shift start?" 6 in the morning, sir." Julian nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. It was insane. It was illogical. He was the head of the syndicate, a man who moved in a world of shadows and violence, a man whose life was a carefully constructed fortress. And he was about to lay siege to a coffee shop barista from Queens. He didn't care. For the first time in a decade, since the death of his father had thrust him onto this dark throne, Julian Kang felt something other than the crushing weight of duty. He felt a spark, a dangerous, intoxicating spark of wanting. And Julian Kang always got what he wanted. The next morning, Elara was running on 4 hours of sleep and pure caffeine. The pre-dawn chill of the coffee shop was her sanctuary. She knew the regulars, the rhythm of the espresso machine, the familiar scent of roasting beans. It was predictable. It was safe. At 6:05 a.m., the bell over the door chimed, announcing the first customer. She looked up with a practiced, weary smile. And the smile died on her lips. It was him, the man from the gala. In the harsh fluorescent light of the coffee shop, he looked even more out of place. His suit was gone, replaced by a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers that still probably cost more than her rent. Without the grandeur of the ballroom around him, his intensity was magnified, a palpable force in the small space. He walked to the counter, his eyes finding hers and holding them. That same unnerving, focused stare. "This is creepy," Elara said, her voice flat. It was the first thing that came to her mind. A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face. "I wanted coffee." "Right," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "And you just happened to wander into this specific, non-chain coffee shop in Queens at 6 in the morning, dressed like that." She gestured vaguely at his expensive attire. "There's a Starbucks 2 blocks away. They'll be much more impressed." He didn't react to her hostility. If anything, he seemed intrigued by it. "I don't like Starbucks," he said simply. "What do you recommend?" She stared at him, trying to figure out his angle. Was this some kind of rich guy power play? A dare? She decided to play along, her exhaustion fueling a reckless sort of bravery. "I recommend our Leave the Barista Alone blend. It's a dark roast, very bitter." A genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, and the effect was devastating. It transformed his harsh, severe features into something achingly handsome. It was a smile like a punch to the chest. Elara felt her own breath catch. "I'll take a large black coffee then," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter. She looked at the bill, then back at his face. "I can't break this." "Keep the change." "I'm not a charity case." The words were out before she could stop them, sharp and defensive. Her pride was a raw, exposed nerve. She hated the assumption that his money could solve anything, that it could buy her compliance or gratitude. He looked genuinely taken aback. He retracted the bill slowly. "My apologies. That was not my intention." He pulled out a wallet, found a 5, and placed it on the counter instead. The gesture was so deliberate, so surprisingly respectful, that it threw her off balance. She made his coffee in silence, her movements stiff. She was acutely aware of him watching her every move. She slid the cup across the counter, avoiding his gaze. $3.50. He paid, took the cup, but didn't leave. He leaned against the counter. "My name is Julian." "I didn't ask," she said, starting to wipe down the espresso machine with unnecessary vigor. "I know." The quiet confidence in those two words infuriated her. He wasn't pushy or aggressive, but there was an unnerving certainty about him, as if her resistance was just a temporary inconvenience. "Look, Julian," she said, finally meeting his eyes again, her own flashing with irritation. "I don't know what you think this is, but I'm at work. I'm not interested, so please, take your coffee and go." "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, as if she hadn't spoken at all. And he turned and left. Alara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was half terrified, half something else. Something she refused to name. She let out a shaky breath and leaned against the counter, the $100 bill he'd first offered seeming to burn an imprint onto the formica. He was back the next day, and the day after that. Every morning at 6:05 a.m., the bell would chime, and Julian Kang would walk in. He never overstayed. He would order a black coffee, pay with exact change, and sometimes attempt a short conversation, which Alara would systematically shut down with monosyllabic answers and sarcastic retorts. She learned to anticipate his arrival with a knot of dread and a flicker of something she staunchly ignored. Her roommate, Chloe, was fascinated. "So, tall, dark, and stalker is still showing up?" she'd ask every afternoon when Alara got home from her second job. "He's not a stalker," Alara grumbled, though she wasn't entirely sure. "He's just persistent and creepy." "Is it legal?" Chloe mused, peering into the fridge. "I mean, for someone that rich to be that obsessed with a normal person, it feels like it should be against some kind of cosmic law." Alara threw a couch cushion at her. "It's not an obsession, it's a weird power trip." But was it? Julian never flexed his power. He never showed up in a fancy car. A black sedan would drop him a block away, and he would walk the rest. He never tried to buy her things again. He just showed up. He listened. On the fourth day, he asked about the art history textbook she had tucked under the counter. "What are you studying?" he'd asked. "The Italian Renaissance," she'd answered shortly, expecting a blank look. "Caravaggio or Bernini?" he'd responded without missing a beat. "I've always found Caravaggio's use of tenebrism to be a more honest depiction of the human condition. The divinity is always encroached upon by shadow." Alara had stared at him, completely thrown. It was the first crack in her defensive wall. She had mumbled something about Bernini's portrayal of movement, and for 2 minutes, they had a real conversation. It left her feeling dizzy and confused. On the 7th day, he didn't come. Alara told herself she was relieved. The knot of dread in her stomach was gone. The coffee shop felt normal again, quiet, empty. She kept glancing at the door, her ears straining for the sound of the bell at 6:05 a.m. It never came. The relief she had expected felt hollow and tasted suspiciously like disappointment. The feeling gnawed at her all day. She was distracted at her catering job that evening, nearly dropping a tray of appetizers. Why did she care? He was a creep. A rich, entitled, handsome, surprisingly intelligent creep. His absence shouldn't matter. But it did. When she got home late that night, exhausted and irritable, there was a long, flat box leaning against her apartment door. It was wrapped in simple brown paper with no card. "Ooh, mystery package from Tall, Dark, and Absent," Chloe said, appearing in the doorway of their tiny apartment. "It's probably a mistake," Alara said, but her heart was beating faster. She carried it inside and set it on their cluttered coffee table. With hesitant fingers, she tore open the paper. Inside was a book, a massive, leather-bound art book. The complete works of Caravaggio. It was a collector's edition, the kind she'd only ever seen in museum gift shops, priced so high she couldn't even dream of owning it. Tucked inside the front cover was a small, plain card. I was called away on business. I thought you might appreciate the company of a fellow master of light and shadow, J. Ilara sank onto the couch, her fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering on the cover. It wasn't a flashy gift. It wasn't jewelry or a car or any of the things a man like him might use to impress a woman. It was thoughtful. It was personal. It showed that he had listened. He had seen her, not as a barista or a caterer, but as a person with passions and dreams, and that was far more dangerous than any amount of money. Chloe whistled softly. Okay, that's not creepy. That's smooth. Damn it. Ilara didn't answer. She opened the book, the smell of old paper and leather filling the air. She was terrified, because a man who sent $100 bills was easy to dismiss. A man who sent Caravaggio was impossible to ignore. Julian returned to the city 2 days later. The business had been brutal, a mandatory trip to Macau to reinforce his authority over a rebellious subsidiary. It involved long nights in smoke-filled rooms, veiled threats, and one very ugly, very necessary display of force in a back alley that left his knuckles raw and his soul feeling a little more tarnished. Throughout it all, the only thing that kept him sane was the thought of a small coffee shop in Queens. The thought of her. He felt the grime of his world clinging to him, and the idea of walking into her clean, bright space felt like a desecration. He needed to be better. He wanted, for the first time, to be a man worthy of stepping into her light. But he didn't know how. All he knew was the darkness he had inherited. He went to the coffee shop the next morning, his nerves for once frayed. What if she'd thrown the book out? What if his gesture had only solidified her opinion of him as a stalker? He walked in at 6:05 a.m. She was there, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked up when the bell chimed, and her eyes met his. She didn't look away. "You came back," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, her voice soft. "I said I would," he replied, his heart settling in his chest. She busied herself with the espresso machine, her back to him. "The book. It was too much." "Was it?" "Yes," she said, turning to face him. "It's beautiful. Thank you." The simple, sincere gratitude in her voice was worth more than any deal he had ever closed, any enemy he had ever vanquished. He felt a smile, a real one, spread across his face. "You're welcome, Ilara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She didn't flinch. She didn't tell him he had no right. She just nodded, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." That morning, she let him stay for 10 minutes. The next day, 15. They talked about art, about the city, about the ridiculousness of some of their customers. He learned that her wit was a shield for a deep kindness, and her cynicism was a product of a life that had given her little reason for optimism. She learned that beneath his imposing silence was a dry, self-deprecating humor and a surprising loneliness that seemed to echo her own. He began to break his own rules. He found excuses to see her outside the coffee shop. One afternoon, he had Minjun arrange for a private after-hours tour of the Frick collection. He'd simply texted her an address and a time. She had almost refused, but curiosity, a powerful and treacherous emotion, won out. She arrived, wary and defensive, to find the entire museum empty, save for him and a single security guard. "How did you do this?" she'd whispered, her voice filled with awe as they stood alone in front of a Rembrandt. "I made a donation," he said simply, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She looked from the priceless art to his face, a troubled expression in her eyes. All of this, it's not my world, Julian." "It could be," he said softly, his gaze intense. It was a promise and a threat, all at once. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She was falling, and she didn't know if he was there to catch her or to ensure she shattered on the pavement below. Their first kiss happened a week later, on a rainy Tuesday night. He had walked her home from her catering shift, holding a large black umbrella over her head, while his own expensive coat got soaked. They stood in the cramped, poorly lit entryway of her building, the sounds of the city muted by the downpour. She looked up at him, at the raindrops clinging to his dark hair, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes that he only ever let her see. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart crumbled to dust. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You don't have to," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Just let me be near you." He lowered his head, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She tilted her face up, and his lips met hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of two lonely worlds. It was the taste of rain and coffee and a longing so profound it ached. In that kiss, she felt the full force of his possession, his absolute certainty that she belonged to him. And the terrifying part was, a piece of her believed it too. The weeks that followed were a dizzying blur. Julian swept her into his life, a world of impossible luxury and privilege. He took her to restaurants where the chefs came out to greet them personally, to operas she'd only read about, to weekends on a yacht that was bigger than her apartment building. But he also cherished the simple things. He seemed happiest when they were just sitting in her cramped apartment, eating takeout and watching old movies, his imposing frame folded onto her lumpy couch. He would listen for hours as she talked about her dreams of one day curating a small gallery, his attention absolute. Ilara found herself falling deeply, irrevocably in love. She loved the way he made her feel safe, the way his quiet strength was a bulwark against the harshness of the world. She loved the gentle side of him that only she was allowed to see. But there were shadows, always shadows. There were the hushed, urgent phone calls he would take in Korean, his voice turning hard and cold. There were the men who were always with him, like Min-jun, with their watchful eyes and the subtle bulges of weapons under their jackets. There were the meetings he couldn't explain, the business trips he was vague about. His family was a complete mystery. He spoke only of an uncle, Chairman Kang, and always with a tone of resentful duty. She tried not to ask. She was afraid of the answers. She told herself his business was just that. Business. Corporate. Cutthroat, maybe, but legal. She clung to that belief like a life raft. The illusion shattered on a cold Thursday in November. Julian was supposed to pick her up for dinner. He was late. Uncharacteristically late. She was pacing her apartment, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, when she heard the sirens. They grew louder, closer, stopping directly outside her building. She rushed to the window and peered down at the street. She saw Julian's black sedan, now riddled with bullet holes, its windows spiderwebbed with cracks. Two other cars were smashed against it. Police lights painted the street in frantic strokes of red and blue. And she saw Julian, standing beside the wreckage, talking to a detective. There was a gash on his temple, and his white shirt was stained with blood. It wasn't his. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a corporate negotiation. This was a war zone. He saw her in the window, and his face, already grim, tightened. He said something to Min-jun, then strode into her building. A moment later, he was at her door. She opened it before he could knock. She stared at the cut on his head, the blood on his shirt, the cold, hard look in his eyes that he had never shown her before. The man from the gala was back, the king of a dark court. "Julian, what happened?" Her voice trembled. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The fortress he had built around his life had been breached, and the darkness was flooding in, threatening to drown her, too. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He sat her down on the couch, the same couch where they had cuddled and watched movies. But now he sat across from her, a chasm of unspoken truths between them. He told her everything. He didn't soften the edges or spare her the ugly details. He told her about his father, the former head of the syndicate. He told her about the inheritance he never wanted, the throne of power built on extortion, smuggling, and violence. He explained that his company was a front for one of the city's most powerful criminal organizations. The attack tonight was from a rival faction trying to move in on his territory. The blood on his shirt belonged to one of his men, a driver who had died protecting him. Each word was a stone, and he built a wall between them with his confession. Alara listened in stunned silence. The world she knew, the man she loved, fractured and reformed into something monstrous and terrifying. Every luxury, every moment of safety she had felt with him, was paid for with violence and fear. The art museum, the restaurants, the book, it was all the fruit of a poisoned tree. She felt sick, betrayed, naive. "You're a gangster," she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "A mob boss." "I am the head of my family," he corrected her, his voice tight with a strange mix of pride and self-loathing. "It is my duty, my burden." "Your burden?" she cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "People died tonight, Julian. A man is dead because of your burden. How could you lie to me? How could you bring me into this filth?" "I never wanted to," he said, and the agony in his voice was real. He looked broken. "I wanted to keep you separate. I wanted one part of my life that was clean. One part that was just you." "But you can't!" she sobbed, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold her shattered world together. "It follows you! It's who you are! And it's on me now. That blood is on me, too." He reached for her, but she flinched away, scrambling back on the couch. The gesture wounded him more than any bullet could have. His hand dropped to his side. "Alara, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I love you. That is the only truth that matters." "Love?" she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You don't love me. You want to own me. I was a novelty to you, the poor girl you could rescue. But you didn't rescue me, Julian. You put me in a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage, but a cage all the same. And the bars are made of blood." She stood up, her body trembling. She couldn't breathe in this room with him anymore. "I want you to go." "No, don't do this." He stood as well, his imposing frame filling the small room. He looked desperate. "We can fix this. I can protect you." "I don't want your protection," she screamed. "I want my life back, the life I had before you. It was hard, and I was always tired, but it was mine." It was honest. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He just stared at her, his dark eyes a swirling vortex of pain and loss. He saw the finality in her face, the unbreachable wall of her principles. He had shown her his true self, and she had rejected it. She had rejected him. He nodded slowly, a single jerky movement. A king accepting his defeat. "All right," he whispered. He turned and walked to the door, his shoulders slumped. He paused with his hand on the knob. "I will have men watching your building, from a distance, to make sure you're safe." "I don't want your guards," she said, her voice cold. "You don't have a choice," he replied, without turning around. "In this, you don't have a choice." And then he was gone. Alara slid down the wall, her legs giving out from under her. She buried her face in her knees and let out a raw, guttural sob. The painful goodbye was a clean break, a surgical amputation, but the phantom limb of him, of what they had, was already beginning to ache with an agony she knew would never truly fade. The days that followed were a study in gray. Ilara went through the motions of her life, but all the color had been drained from her world. The coffee shop was just a job again. Her apartment was just a place to sleep. She returned the Caravaggio book to his empty penthouse with a note that simply said, "I can't." She knew one of his invisible men would ensure he got it. Chloe tried her best, offering ice cream and bad movies and endless support. "You did the right thing," she'd say, her voice gentle. "He's dangerous. You couldn't have a real life with him." "I know," Ilara would whisper. "I know." But knowing it didn't stop the ache in her chest, a constant physical pain that made it hard to breathe. She missed him. She missed his quiet presence, his wry humor, the impossible safety she felt in his arms. She had chosen her principles over her heart, and the righteousness of her decision was cold comfort in the long, empty nights. Her mother called, disapproving of the mysterious, wealthy man who had suddenly vanished, her pragmatic worries a fresh layer of salt in the wound. "I told you men like that were trouble," she'd said, and for once, Ilara didn't have the energy to argue. For Julian, life without Ilara was a return to the abyss. His world, which had been briefly illuminated by her light, was now darker than ever before. He threw himself into his work with a cold, ruthless efficiency. He crushed the rival faction that had dared to attack him, his methods so brutal they sent a chill through the entire underworld. He was a king reasserting his power, but the throne felt cold and empty. He sat in his penthouse, surrounded by priceless art and silent luxury, and felt nothing but a profound, crushing loneliness. The Caravaggio book sat on his desk, a constant, painful reminder of what he had lost. He saw her everywhere, in the face of a stranger on the street, in the scent of coffee from a passing cafe, in the silence of his own bed. His uncle, Chairman Kang, saw his nephew's misery as an opportunity. "This is what happens when you entertain distractions," the older man said during a tense meeting. "This girl, this commoner, she made you weak. You are a Kang. Your only bride is this family, this power. It is time you remembered that." For the first time, Julian looked at his uncle and saw not a mentor, but the architect of his prison. This legacy, this burden, had cost him the only thing that had ever truly mattered. A cold fury began to smolder within him. A rebellion was taking root. The breaking point came a month after Ilara had left. It was at a formal dinner with the heads of the other families, a necessary political ritual. Julian, trying to show a united front, had insisted Ilara attend as his guest, a desperate last-ditch attempt to show her that she could be a part of his world. He had promised her it would be different. He had been a fool. And that was when his uncle had looked at the woman Julian loved more than life itself and dismissed her. "She is just staff." After he had cleared the room, after he had guided Ilara away from the wreckage of the evening, he took her back to her apartment. The ride was silent, thick with unspoken emotions. He walked her to her door, the same door where he had confessed his world to her, the same door where she had sent him away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I never should have put you in that position. I thought I could protect you in my world, but my world is poison." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had seen the way he'd defended her. She had felt the protective fury radiating from him. It wasn't about possession. It was about honor. Her honor. "It's not your fault, Julian," she whispered. "It's the world." "Then I'll change the world," he said, the decision solidifying in his mind, hard as diamond. My world, anyway. It was a grand gesture, a promise so immense she couldn't possibly believe it. But looking into his eyes, she saw not the arrogance of a king, but the desperate conviction of a man willing to burn down his own kingdom for a chance at redemption. He didn't kiss her. He just gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Give me some time," he whispered. "Wait for me." And he left. The next day, Julian Kang declared war on his own legacy. He called a meeting with his top lieutenants, Minjun at his side. He announced his intention to legitimize their operations, all of them. He would sell off the illicit businesses, the loan sharking, the gambling rackets, the smuggling. He would invest the capital into legitimate enterprises, real estate, tech startups, hospitality. It would be a long, bloody, and dangerous process. It would make them vulnerable. It would cut their profits in half, at least initially. Many were opposed. Chairman Kang was incandescent with rage. "You are destroying your father's legacy! You spit on his grave!" he roared in a private confrontation. "My father's legacy is a tomb," Julian retorted, his voice cold as steel. "I refuse to be buried in it. This family will evolve, or it will die. I'm choosing evolution. You can either be with me, or you can be an artifact of the past." The threat was clear. The old guard could adapt or be swept away. It was a monumental gamble, one that could get him killed. He started the painful process of cutting ties, making enemies of men who were once allies. He negotiated with federal prosecutors through back channels, offering information on his rivals in exchange for a blind eye while he cleaned house. He worked day and night, fueled by coffee and the faint, lingering hope of a future with Alara. Minjun, ever loyal, stood by him, managing the transition with quiet, brutal efficiency. 6 months passed. 6 months of violence, threats, and treacherous negotiations. Julian survived 2 assassination attempts, but slowly, painstakingly, the landscape of his empire began to shift. The shadows receded, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving light of legitimacy. He was no longer a mob boss. He was becoming a CEO. A ruthless, intimidating CEO with a dark past, but a CEO nonetheless. Ilara waited. She had quit her catering job and poured all her energy into her studies and her work at the coffee shop. She followed the business news, where whispers of Julian Kang's radical corporate restructuring were beginning to make headlines. She saw his picture once in a financial paper, and he looked tired, harder, but there was a new light in his eyes. She never lost faith. She didn't know the details of his war, but she knew he was fighting it for her. One crisp autumn evening, a year to the day since they had first met at the gala, her doorbell rang. Her heart stopped. She knew, somehow, she knew it was him. She opened the door. Julian stood there. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit or a cashmere sweater. He wore simple jeans and a worn leather jacket. There was a new scar high on his cheekbone, a faint white line that spoke of the battles he had fought. He looked tired, vulnerable, and more handsome than she had ever seen him. He held out a single, perfect white rose. "It's not entirely clean yet," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "It may never be. There will always be shadows. But it's different now. It's safer. It's a world I can ask you to be a part of without fearing it will destroy you." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a king anymore, Alara. I'm just a man who loves you. Is that enough?" Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. It was more than enough. It was everything. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled his face down to hers. The reunion kiss was nothing like their first. It wasn't born of desperation or hunger. It was a kiss of profound relief, of promises kept, of a future earned. It was slow and deep and tasted of hope. It was the end of their separation and the true beginning of their life. Epilogue. 2 years later, Alara stood in the center of a brightly lit gallery, her gallery. It was small, intimate, and featured the work of emerging local artists. The Vance Gallery had become her dream made real, funded by a legitimate business loan from a bank that had no idea its primary investor was her husband. The bell over the door chimed, and Julian walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop in Queens she still visited every week. He smiled at her, the smile that was still reserved only for her, the one that made her heart skip a beat every single time. His life was still complex. The shadows of his past hadn't vanished entirely, but they were manageable, kept at bay by a formidable legal team and the sheer force of his will. He was a respected, if feared, figure in the city's business community. He handed her a coffee and wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. He looked around the gallery, at the vibrant paintings on the white walls. "I'm proud of you," he murmured into her hair. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You could have," he countered softly. "You would have found a way. You're the most resilient person I've ever met. I'm just the lucky man who got to watch." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face, her fingers tracing the faint scar on his cheek. She had her own life, her own success, her own identity. He had never tried to change that. He had only ever sought to protect it, to give her the safety and stability she needed to let her own strength flourish. He had redeemed his world, not just for her, but with her. "I love you, Julian Kang," she whispered. "And I love you, Alara Vance Kang," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion that would never fade. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, familiar kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of battles won and a peace finally, blessedly found. In the quiet sanctuary of their new world, surrounded by light and color and art, the kingpin and the barista had finally found their way home. This story teaches us about the transformative power of love and the courage it takes to change. It shows that a person's past does not have to define their future, and that true strength lies not in power or control, but in the vulnerability and sacrifice required to become worthy of the love you wish to receive. It is a reminder that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves a chance at redemption. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. If this story resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel for more content like this, and sharing it with someone who might also enjoy it. Your support helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. Now, we have a question for you. What did you think of the moment Julian cleared the table for Alara? Was it a turning point for you as a viewer? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, we want your input on our next story. Which character would you like to see featured next? A. The story of Minjin, the loyal second in command, and a new love that tests his unwavering allegiance. B. The story of Chloe, Alara's best friend, who accidentally gets involved with a rival family's charming but dangerous heir. Cast your vote in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.